Hello, I'm Melissa Taff and I'm new here. And I'm here today to speak to you about indigenizing your curriculum. I'd like to start off by illustrating my experience in this field, as well as my Indigenous education credentials, conferences I've attended, and it's zero. I have neither formal nor informal education in this area or training, but I was asked to speak on the subject because I was able to integrate some Indigenous content and awareness into my courses with very little effort, and I believe it's something that we can all do and try to make happen in small ways. So why are we Indigenizing our curriculum? We have two reasons for doing this. Number one is to assist the learning environment of Aboriginal students in our classroom. And number two is to enlighten our Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal students regarding Indigenous studies. And I think we can all benefit from more cultural awareness. So how do we do this? Can we add an Indigenous Canadians module to our diversity classes? Sure. But our goal is to indigenize all subjects. So we're trying to weave a common thread throughout all of our common thread of Indigenous studies and pedagogy throughout all of our teaching. So how do we indigenize subjects that don't analyze cultural practices as a part of their curriculum? How would Kevin indigenize an anatomy class? Heather Milburn teaches math and computer studies. What is the Métis traditional way of approaching Excel formulas? I don't know. Some courses are going to be easier and some courses are going to be much more difficult. But it really is imperative that we begin integrating some Indigenous curriculum throughout all of our courses. As most of you are aware, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has spent the last few years investigating the tragedy of Aboriginal residential schools across Canada, and they've uncovered many shocking truths about the mistreatment of Indigenous people and what has been described as both a cultural genocide and the systemic physical and sexual abuse of children. And many of these children didn't survive at all. Statistically speaking, as an Aboriginal child sent to a residential school in Canada, you had a lower rate of survival than someone enlisted in World War II. So the Truth and Reconciliation Committee came up with a list of 94 calls to action for the Canadian people and our government. Most of these recommendations referred to four main issues: education, the justice system, media representation, and healthcare. As educators, it is our responsibility to cover the education part of this tenet, but in addition to that, how many people in this room teach students who are aspiring to interact with the public in the delivery of legal or medical services? I mean, how many people in this room aren't teaching someone who in their future is going to be delivering some sort of legal or medical service? And we know it's our job to prepare students for their futures in the workplace, but these specific fields, we need to be preparing them to provide equal and accessible legal and medical services to all Canadians. And for Indigenous Canadians, these legal and medical needs are not being addressed. So we need to prepare the next generation of Canadian legal and healthcare workers to do this. Great idea, Melissa. But how do we do this? I don't know. What I tried was to bring more awareness about Indigenous cultures and issues into my classroom, and I did it in very small ways. I also found it very easy and natural. So I'd like to share some with you. I used my ethics class, which was a new course prep for me last fall, as a pilot project. So right off the bat, you can start by acknowledging where we are, and that's what I'd like to do right now. So here at Durham College, we are currently standing on land that was a home to Indigenous people. Some of you may know this, others of you may have been aware but don't have a reason to consider it every day. So one way we can begin to do this is to recognize the traditional territories that we're on. So Durham College is situated on the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nations. They're Ojibwa people and a part of the Anishinaabe. We'd like to acknowledge the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nations community for allowing us to be guests on their territories. And making this type of acknowledgement takes about 30 seconds. It can be done in any type of class. And some educators like to do it on the first day of class. As you're welcoming students to Durham College, you can recognize where we are as well. That's also an opportune time to introduce Suswaning and Dajig, the Aboriginal Student Center. It's located in the Simcoe building. I'd love to give you more direction on that when I figure out how the Simcoe building works. I can tell you that it's a great place for students. It offers a full-scale, holistic approach to supporting students, and I found them a fantastic resource myself as a professor. So the staff at Siswananga-Dajig, Julie and Peggy, can come into your classroom and deliver presentations, or preferably you can take your class to them. If you take your class into the center, they have a lot better setup to deliver presentations and workshops. So they have a couple that they do deliver. There's maybe 10 standard ones, but they can also modify stuff for your class. The main one is this Cultural Safety Initiative, which again is a 2-hour crash course on Indigenous studies. But they also offer a couple other ones that I thought might be relevant to things we teach in this room, like restorative justice models, medicine wheel teachings, and working effectively with Aboriginal clients. So after I acknowledged the traditional territories and told the class all about Siswananga-Dajig and what they have to offer, the following week we were studying Matz and Sykes neutralization techniques. We typically apply these techniques to rationalize the negative behaviors of emergency service personnel, but as a practice activity, I wanted the students to apply the techniques to a different type of scenario. So I had them apply these rationalizations to the negative conduct of the administrators of Aboriginal residential schools. The exercise required students to place themselves in the position of these school administrators and essentially synthesize their rationalizations for committing horrific acts. So many of my students reported having no knowledge at all of residential schools in Canada. So as a precursor, we watched a video, some video footage summarizing the atrocities and reparations surrounding the issue. And then afterwards, we discussed the outcomes of these neutralization techniques and the students' feelings about the topics that we discussed. In week 4, I had Peggy Forbes from Siswananga-Dajig come in and deliver a 2-hour cultural safety awareness presentation to the class. This presentation is fantastic. It's basically a 2-hour crash course in Indigenous studies. It covers historical, cultural, and political topics that impact the lives of Indigenous Canadians. This is a great presentation for any Canadian citizen, period, and was really well received by the students. There is also a massive differential in the knowledge amongst our students, depending on their previous educational experiences. So in my class of 65 students, I had about half the class with no knowledge of Indigenous studies or people or issues at all. And the other half had very, very limited and little knowledge, and some of it was misinformation as well. So of the half that did know, there was maybe in my 65-person class about 3 or 4 students who had a fairly good working knowledge of Indigenous studies. In week 7, I set up some discussion groups wherein students would apply the practices of moral reasoning to current ethical dilemmas. The groups would discuss the highly controversial issues amongst themselves and come up to a group conclusion. And to assist in this collaboration, I utilized the Aboriginal practice of sharing circles. So like most of you, I run group activities regularly, and I have students typically just arrange themselves around the furniture. For this exercise, I fully committed, and I removed all the desks from the classroom space. So we just had chairs in circles. And I had the students sit in these circles and discuss the type of communication that we were about to embark on. And there they sat, knee to knee, shoulder to shoulder, looking in each other's eyes on the same level. And we talked about the importance of sharing circles and the Aboriginal roots. So the sharing circles are known to encourage dialogue, respect, and social discourse. And I found that by removing all the desks and sitting the students shoulder to shoulder, they were all looking in each other's eyes, and there was nothing to hide behind. They were very present and accountable. So there was no desk to put their computer on and hide behind. There was no desk to hide their phone under and distract themselves. So every student was accountable in the circles, and it really, really worked. And the students loved it, and it made for some deep learning and a very respectful environment to take a sensitive approach to controversial subject matter. If you're teaching a subject that doesn't lend itself to opportunities to showcase Indigenous culture, you might want to consider integrating Indigenous ways of learning and knowing. So sharing circles are one approach, but there are many. Dr. Mary Batiste describes Aboriginal pedagogy as being found in talking or sharing in circles and dialogues, participant observation, experiential learning, modeling, meditation, prayer ceremonies, storytelling, and that's how we have ways of learning and knowing. She notes learning by doing and observing, participating in authentic, enjoyable experiences. Sound familiar? Because I feel like these are some of the new tenets of education that we've spent the last years researching. These are also the principles behind Finland's wildly successful education system everyone's talking about. So these are just ways of knowing that Indigenous Canadians have always practiced. By week 11, I had already briefly discussed several Indigenous topics by the time I hit the actual diversity module of the course. And during this topic, we covered cultural practices common to many First Nation groups. We discussed competing human rights using an example that involved Indigenous cultural practices of smudging. And we also referenced National Aboriginal Day. We then analyzed how these cultural distinctions may impact access to both justice and healthcare. And finally, when discussing ethical issues surrounding cultural differences, we considered cultural appropriation. So we discussed a few of the common topics today, like yoga. It's a very hot topic with cultural appropriation. We also discussed things like hipster headdresses, fashion moccasins, and tribal tattoos. Throughout the semester, we also addressed a few other Anishinaabe cultural practices and beliefs. We discussed the linear views that our actions in this life are influenced by the generations that came before us and will continue to influence 7 generations after us. So the topic came up very naturally in a discussion where students were expressing a feeling of hopelessness. Some students I heard saying things will never change, things will never get better. And this message was very timely in the discussion, and I later realized it may be particularly useful for individuals who are around 19 years of age. It's an important lesson for young people to realize the roots and the building blocks that created who they are and where they are, and also to realize that their actions and movements will start to affect people and create a ripple effect 7 generations ahead of them. So we took time to consider that. We also took time to consider the reciprocity after our presentation from Peggy. So we discussed the Aboriginal tenet of giving and receiving to create a balance. And in this spirit, we created a thank you gift for Peggy to honor her efforts and thank her for her time and reciprocate our appreciation to her. And finally, we discussed the prophecy of the 8th fire. So Anishinaabe believe in the stories of the 7 fires, and that in the near future, the light-skinned race will be given a choice between 2 roads. If they choose the right road, the 7th fire will light the 8th fire, which is the final fire, and it's the eternal fire that burns forever. And it will create an eternal fire of peace and sister and brotherhood amongst us. And if we make the wrong choice, of course, then we don't get any of that stuff and bad things will happen. But let's make it happen. Let's light that 8th fire. So on that note, you'll remember that I began this journey with no experience or knowledge. And this movement came from a fire that was lit in me during a visit to Siswaning and Dodging. I would like to share that fire with you. The Aboriginal Student Centre has offered to host 2 special presentations of their Cultural Safety Awareness Initiative for the Schools of Justice and IS. They will be held in May, and I hope that some of you can make it. Even if you have no intention of indigenizing your curriculum for next fall, just come out to one of these presentations and check it out. At the very least, it might be a great opportunity for some of you to check out the Aboriginal Student Centre for the first time. I can get them to perform smudging if we were into that. And I'll be sending out a follow-up email next week with the dates of the presentations, and I'll be looking for some RSVPs. We're short on time, so I can't answer any questions right now, which is good because I probably wouldn't know how to answer them anyway. So if you do have any questions, just send me an email and I will try to find you an answer or someone smarter to help you with it. Thank you very much. Have a great day.